So I'm going to talk about circulatory routes, about the blood vessels themselves. In your textbook, in the chapter 19, there are maps like this of the routes of blood vessels. And really, these are like road maps. There's two that correspond to one another. There's this one, and there's this one. This one is the anatomically correct version. This is a schematic that basically looks at the branches and what branches off of what. So uh, I'm going to talk about general principles and not expecting you to memorize anything more than the major blood vessels that I'll talk about here. So the aorta comes out of the left ventricle of the heart, and it moves superiorly, and then it arches and then comes down the left side of the spine through the thorax and the abdomen. So we call the aorta the ascending aorta, the arch of the aorta, the thoracic aorta, and then when it passes through the diaphragm, the abdominal aorta. That's the major supply of systemic blood everywhere. So the important things to note are that the branches off of the aorta take the shortest route possible to the organs that they supply. So, for instance, when the aorta leaves the heart, the first branches are the coronary arteries because they supply the heart. At the arch of the aorta, there are three branches. Because the aorta is to the left, then one branch, the first branch of the aorta, of the arch of the aorta, so the first major branch is called the brachiocephalic, and it goes to the right side of your head and your right upper limb, because it's a trunk that leaves the aorta and heads right. The brachiocephalic immediately branches into the common carotid that goes up to the head, and the subclavian, which goes under the clavicle and supplies the arm. So the first branch of the aorta, brachiocephalic, supplies the right head and neck. On the left side, there's no need for the brachiocephalic, so it's not there. The left has the common carotid coming directly off of the aortic arch to supply the left side of the head, and the left subclavian supplies the left arm. Then there are branches all off of the thorax that basically go to two places. The organs of the chest cavity, the thorax, so that would be the mediastinal, the esophageal, the bronchial, which is not the pulmonary, it's the one that feeds the interstitium of the lungs, and the pericardium, which is all the organs that you find in the thorax. There are parietal branches that basically supply the muscles of respiration, the intercostal muscles. They supply the spinal cord and that kind of thing. And then another parietal branch supplies the diaphragm. You can imagine that how much work the diaphragm gets. It works every single breath that you take. Once the aorta passes through the diaphragm, it has visceral and parietal branches as well. The parietal branches go to the diaphragm, the posterior abdominal wall, with the lumbar, and the down in the sacrum and coccyx region. The visceral branches are very, very, very important. There's one called the celiac trunk, which I will explain in a second, but it supplies the liver, the gallbladder, the spleen, the stomach, the bottom of the esophagus, and the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. The intestines themselves you can imagine, need a huge blood supply, because this is where not only do they get fed by arterial blood, but the capillaries in the intestines absorb all the nutrients and then supply the nutrients to the rest of the body. And there's two of them that run in the mesenteries, so we call the upper one the superior mesenteric and the lower one the inferior mesenteric. So they supply all of your guts. We need to supply the kidneys and the adrenal glands, so that's the suprarenal and the adrenal. And we have to supply the gonads, so that's testes or ovaries, depending on what you have. Then the aorta in the abdomen branches into two, the common iliacs, which then go down and supply the legs. So it ends up looking anatomically like this. You can see that the right side of the head is supplied by the brachiocephalic here. The branches of the brachiocephalic become the subclavian here to the arm, the carotids, common carotids that supply the head. Basically, I'm just going to sum this up by saying that the carotid arteries, there's an internal carotid that supplies the brain, and there is an external carotid that supplies the outside of the skull, so the face, the occiput, the superficial temporal, that kind of thing. Now, there's an important consideration coming here off of the subclavian. There's a branch that also supplies the brain, and it's called the vertebral artery. It passes up through the transverse foramen of the cervical spine. I'm going to leave all of the branches of this, of the brain, until later. I would like to actually do it in person, so I will take a few minutes of in-class time to do it. When we supply the arm, what I want you to see in this, and this is a fairly complicated looking diagram, but basically the branches go here. So common carotid, and then up to the brain with the vertebral. The thyrocervical goes to the thyroid. There's one that comes down that supplies the anterior chest wall, so we call it the internal thoracic, so it's the thorax. You can see that each branch goes where it's supposed to, like there's a pectoral branch going to the pectoralis muscles, etc. The important thing is that the artery, the main supplying artery, the elastic artery, when it's under the clavicle is called subclavian, when it's in the armpit is called axillary, when it's in the arm, it's called the brachial. Then it divides into two, running down the forearm, called the radial and the ulnar, and this is where you get the pulse. All these are big elastic arteries. When it gets to the hand, there's a couple of arches in the palm called palmar arches, and then the digital arteries go to the fingers. The important consideration here is that this main artery, the subclavian axillary brachial, is really the same artery, just with different names. And it corresponds to where it's found. As I said, when the aorta comes through the diaphragm, the main arteries that come off are to the visceral are the celiac trunk, the superior mesenteric, and the inferior mesenteric as unpaired arteries. There's only one of each of these, and it basically does the digestive system. The stomach by the gastric, the hepatic does the liver, the spleen the duodenum, the gastroduodenal, etc. They all have names about where they go. Please, celiac trunk, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric are unpaired. The superior mesenteric does the small intestine and the ascending and transverse colon. So it does the right side of your guts and the small intestine. The inferior mesenteric supplies the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and the rectum. So it does. So if superior mesenteric it does upper right, then inferior mesenteric does lower left. The other major branch goes to the kidneys. The kidneys take about 20% of the blood, so they're huge arteries, but they're paired, one to each kidney, and they're called the renal arteries. Straightforward enough. Again, I would like to do this in class and explain it. This video is just an overview. This is what it looks like. The celiac trunk is here. The superior mesenteric artery is here. The inferior mesenteric artery is there. It's much smaller. The renal arteries are here. The phrenic, the lumbars, all the parietal branches are fairly small. This is the branches of the superior mesenteric, and you can see, oh, these are the mesenteric. So there's the superior mesenteric doing all of this, and the inferior mesenteric doing all of this. When we get into the leg, it's very much like the arm. There's the common iliac, branches into the internal iliac and the external iliac. The external iliac does the lower limb. The internal iliac does your butt and your external genitalia. When it passes under the inguinal ligament, it changes names from the external iliac to the femoral because it runs down the femur. It passes behind the knee, so it starts out in front, and then it passes through a hole in the adductor magnus called the adductor hiatus. When it passes through that hole, it changes names to the popliteal artery, which means behind the knee artery. The popliteal artery branches into two branches. The one that goes in front of the tibia, called the anterior tibial. One that goes behind the tibia, it's called the posterior tibial. There's one that runs off the posterior tibial down the femur, down the fibula, called the fibular. And then it supplies the foot. Again, just broad categories of this.